I'll speak from here, and the format of my presentation is a little bit different. It's always the hard act to follow Ruth when she gives a presentation. So I'll do something slightly different so that you don't compare my performance with her. And the subject is industrial justice in a dynamic and conflictual society. But what I really want to talk about is how one sees labor law as a non-lawyer, as someone who is a sociologist studying the institutions of modern capitalist societies. And then what is it that stands out about labor law? This is interesting insofar as, of course, contract law is a very long heritage of especially European societies going back to Roman law. And it is full of very interesting, but for the outsider, totally unintelligible things like caveat emptor, for example. Yeah, these wonderful things that have been compiled by so many smart people in the 4th century. Labor law is different. And what I want to begin with is to say something on the nature of classical labor law as it arose in especially the 1920s, partly in Germany, partly in Britain, and then sort of spread to many other countries where it was seen as something that was contract law in one sense, but then contract law in a very modified sense, which raises the interest of the sociologists. Now, 4 points. What labor law does is, in the view of a sociologist, an outsider, is that it creates a political regime. It is a constitutional law as much as it is contract law. It sets up a number of organizations in society and action levels and legitimate actors intervening in the action of contract making, which basically results in a very complex organization. And this is because it is not just interested in contract, like old contract law, where the question is simply, are the two parties free to agree? In other words, are they acting under duress or not? And if they are not acting under duress, then the contract is fine and it has to be enforced. Whereas in classical labor law, there's a concern with the justice of contracts, with not just work being exchanged, but decent work becoming the outgrowth of contracting in labor markets. It tries to prevent contracting for indecent work in favor of decent work, makes that distinction a normative distinction regarding the outcomes of contract making. Moreover, as we touched on in the previous discussion of Ruth's presentation, it is not just state law, it is also social law, law from above and law from below. It opens up the rulemaking regime to a number of different influences under the roof of the state, but then allowing, licensing other actors to also have a word and create law, which basically means that dogmatic consistency and pragmatic predictability is not everything. There's also substantive justice involved, and there's the need for participation. So this is a sort of, and I will come back to that subject, it is an impressively open and dynamic system of rulemaking, unlike, for example, classical contract law, where you can go back to a long, long tradition and what has come out of it in civil law in the 19th century. Here, it is not just the lawyer that says something about the law. It is the people who are immediately affected also have a word. It is in that sense democratic law from above, from not just from above, but also from below. Third point, labor law is sort of conceivable only if we understand that it happens in a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, work and labor is treated as a commodity with a price. There is a performance that is bought, and then there is a price paid for it. Labor law, however, is not just commercial law, because it recognizes that the commodity that is being traded is an imperfect commodity. Imperfect in the sense that if you sell a car or a banana, then you're done. You go home, watch TV, and you collect the price for the banana or for the car. But if you sell your labor, then you have to sort of come along. The labor it cannot be dissociated from your person. It is not something that you hand over to the employer and then the employer goes home and uses it for whatever purposes. No, you have to be present. And you have to spend a very valuable resource. Some of the 24 hours a day has. There's a living being, so to speak, that wants to sleep and eat and not just work. And the practice of working is immediately related to a social relationship. And that social relationship is one of authority. The employer tells you what he or she expects from you, and you then have to do it, or you are breaching the contract. In other words, it's a very living, a very social, relational thing that we're seeing here, much, much different from the normal commercial contract. Moreover, classical labor law takes into account that when it comes to selling labor, to contracting for work, in that moment, class relations begin to play a role in a capitalist society. By class relations, I mean that capitalist societies, however democratically organized they might be, are basically societies composed of two classes. One class owning capital and the other not owning capital, and all that they can do is sell their labor time. Now, one can even add to this that one of the interesting characteristics of a capitalist society is that it is organized around the production of ever more capital to be invested, so that you can add even more capital to already accumulated capital, and that is privately owned capital. Maybe 5% of society own it. The rest have to sort of make a contribution to so that they can become richer by appropriating the capital that you produce in the labor process under the authority of those who own capital. Now that is a very conflictual, basically very conflictual relationship. And the problem of this regime that we call labor law is to make it possible that on top of this very basic conflict, there can be something like productive cooperation between members of these two classes that is considered just in at least some minimal way by everyone, because otherwise it wouldn't work. And that's the very sort of subtle, complex, difficult function that labor law plays in a society. It must make it possible that there is some sort of productive exchange between the two classes that satisfy standards of justice, at least minimal standards of justice, otherwise the cooperation breaks down. I'll say something more on what justice means in this context. Here is the sources of asymmetrical, what I call asymmetrical class power. there are in labor markets, in markets for labor, more workers than employers, and workers have a greater urgency with respect to being employed. You cannot just wait for half a year and eat nothing, because then you're dead. So unless you have some other source of nourishment, what the employer offers you, you have to take. You already see that, for example, social policy and unemployment insurance play a very important part in balancing this relationship. Very importantly, in the organization of, you basically have two venues where regulation, where this regime plays a role: in the market for labor and in the organization of work, the labor process. Labor is a cost factor for the employer. That's very important. He tries to reduce the cost. That is what the employer, he or she, has to do, because they take the so-called residual, that what remains after all the costs, after the production factors have been paid. And the incentive is to make the labor process more productive by innovation, or what Schumpeter calls a new combination of production factors, which means that if you're an employee, your boss may come and may tell you, look, I have this wonderful new typewriter, and please from now on use that typewriter, not the other. And then you suddenly figure out that this is much more productive, and you would like to be paid according to that productivity. And there you already have a little problem with your contract, right? Because the employer is the one who organizes the work, the labor process, not you. So in classical labor law, the assumption is that in order for employment contracts to be fair and its terms just, you have to have collective institutions that make the power distribution between sellers and buyers more equal. Then the more that is the case, and again I come back to how that can be so, then the terms of the contract are seen as minimally just, industrial justice, and there this has sort of two different functions in a society. One is an efficiency function. You want workers to be not really happy, but willing to perform the job that they are being assigned. So they have to have some element of consensus. But you also want in a society that normative ideas of justice are being served, at least to some extent. Otherwise, that society becomes an oppressive society at risk of divisive conflict rather than managed conflict. So in order for civilization of labor markets and the work process, and for economic efficiency, for these two reasons, you have to have institutions that do something about these asymmetries in class power. Here, in order for, I write all this down because I thought there would be a simultaneous interpreter sitting there to make their lives easier. But it's also for me easier because I can just point to this. So classical labor law provides, in addition to contacts between individuals, also for contacts between collectives. And Ruth has explained this. This is the main idea of classical labor law, of how to not necessarily equalize, but sort of make less stark the power differential between the two classes that meet in the labor market and in the labor process. Introducing collective action in addition to individual action. That is accommodating what is seen as the collectivism of workers into the regulatory regime of the relationship between workers and employers. Yeah, that is such a legal innovation in the 20th century, responding to the contingencies of a capitalist society, that one can really, it's really breathtakingly interesting at least for an outsider who doesn't start with this thing. It's breathtakingly interesting that our societies were able to invent this sort of, you can say, management process to make it possible that industrial work is not permanent in industrial civil war. So there is an element of state licensing of quasi-public collective intervention in private individual contracting to make this contracting more egalitarian and the results more voluntarily acceptable. Remember classical contract law, where the assumption, the presumption is that it is voluntary to the extent that it is free, and it is free to the extent that there is no obvious pressure, or there's no gun there to the head of the party that signs the contract. But here, the labor law sort of imposes on the process of contracting for work an institution that sort of in a self-regulatory way can find out how voluntary the contract is by inserting collective action into that relationship. That relationship is one, you can also say, of constitutional law. It builds up institutions through which people can be empowered to intervene in the liberal market and regulate that market with respect to its outcomes. Yeah, it's the longer one thinks about it, the more exciting this institutional setup is. Now I come to the issue of industrial justice, or as the International Labour Organization now calls it, decent work. That is a normative issue, and it cannot be settled by economic calculation. So there is no algorithm to determine what is industrial justice and what not. You cannot put it into artificial intelligence machines. It involves human beings who experience their position in labor markets and in the labor process, and who want to be convinced by the process that they are part of, that they are not being, as we say, torn across the table. They have to see that they are being taken seriously. An element of dignity is also very much involved in industrial relations. The perception that you are not being taken for granted, like a banana you buy in the banana shop, whenever there is the banana shop. So now, where on what are the conditions that define what industrial justice is? And there, I think one has to look empirically, and we will talk about methodology later in this session. That one has to look empirically on a number of things, number of parameters of the work situation in labor markets and in work organizations that involve, for example, technical possibilities. The technology is changing all the time. Is it being used to enhance the profit of the employer? Obviously, yes. But is it also, and can it also be used to enhance the dignity of the worker and the worker's capacity to influence his or her situation? Economic conditions. Markets impose constraints, but they also entail opportunities, and it is the job of entrepreneurs in capitalism to see these opportunities. But in order to exploit the opportunities, they need the help of others. What is the formula where you decide which side gets what? And of course, there is no standard formula. It is a formula that has to be worked out in this constitutional process that is called labor market. The political windows of opportunity, the government changes, that is something that influences what workers perceive as industrial justice. If in the United Kingdom there would have been a Corbyn government, then it would be very likely that many workers would think, comparing to the possibilities that politics might have opened up to them, that the situation in which they have to work is no longer fair, because it now could be different. Yeah, the perception of opportunity is important. The power relations, of course, trade union power raising the level of aspirations of workers. This is why in a neoliberal environment you don't want trade unions, because trade unions go to workers and they tell them it could be different, friends, if you do something about it. Yeah, and what I really want to bring out from the perspective of the social scientist is the normative constructivist aspect of what law and what justice is. It's an interactional process. It is not something that a lawyer can think of. It is sort of conditional on a situation in which many different factors, like, for example, cultural developments and family structures interfere. 30 years ago, it would have been hardly possible to raise the issue of how to make it possible for individuals to combine family life and work. Not only that, how, for example, single parents could manage their responsibilities as family members, as well as their responsibilities as laid down in their contract with their employer. Yeah, and as that arises, discussions can begin on whether our employment structure and our employment law is still fair and just, because it doesn't do justice to these things. In Ruth's work and my work, where we looked at the development of standards of justice as it is anchored in the everyday lives of people, we saw we found that regulating the relationship between working life and family life becomes an overriding concern for a very great number of people, which is new. But the open system of labor law should be able to allow for this to penetrate into the workplace and into regulating the workplace. Very importantly, something that also came up when discussing Ruth's presentation in the question part, how is it possible to monitor and enforce the norms of decent work? And there the answer can only be that even collective bargaining at the sectoral level doesn't help you much unless you have some sort of instant monitoring mechanisms on the ground, where work has to be performed. On the ground means at the workplace. In other words, that, however, cannot be done by a state inspectorate. You cannot put a policeman into every workplace. But what you can do is you can have trade union representatives, shop stewards, works councils, who can follow, who are able to follow, and you have a right to follow what happens at the workplace in terms of the implementation of the norms of justice that are of decent work, that are sort of installed at the national or central level, but that need to be actually performed at the workplace. So institution building which uses the existing social relations among workers, the collectivism of workers at the workplace, in order to enforce the norms that are generated either by collective action or by the state or by the two together in a learning process. And that's another element I want to emphasize. Good labor law is learning law. It is law in a dynamic society. So industrial change, dealing with highly dynamic conditions, technological progress, changing labor supply and demand. And labor supply is also the characteristics of people. in the book that Ruth and I are going to publish, hopefully early next year, we discuss, for example, how intelligent regulation of labor markets can accommodate the obviously growing demand of people for more discretion as to the use of their time, for more flexibility, without handing power over to employers. How can you build flexibility and also entrepreneurialism into the organization of labor markets and work organizations without handing authority to employers, but giving workers also a chance to do it, and without undermining standards of justice. Evolving social structures, giving rise to changing needs of workers with respect to the intersection of work and non-work, work-life balance. And that's what I think is the other fascinating aspect of labor law, that it needs to be living law. Living law that emerges in the interactions of people and then is being perceived, if things work well, by trade unions, courts, governments, that however have in mind the need for fairness and justice, and not just for capital accumulation. So I want to go on to my last point. See, what I also find interesting here is that from the beginning, labor law was in an interesting way both systematic and opportunistic. Opportunistic in the sense that in the 19th century, it was completely clear that a capitalist society could not be governed productively without accommodating the collectivism of workers, the solidarity of workers. It had to be somewhere. You could not suppress it. If you tried to suppress it, you were destroying the entire system. So on the one hand, labor law goes like, yeah, unfortunately, these people will not learn. They won't become individuals. They think their commodity is not a commodity. They want rights. My God, yeah. But then you have to learn. If you do not listen to this, you are asking for disaster. Yeah. Now then you see a lot of what is today called industrial democracy, co-determination and so on, results from the need to accommodate this sort of natural resistance to the commodification of labor power that is inside all of us. And then, of course, politically, the answer is to give, to create institutions that not just recognize, but educate this sort of demand. Yeah, tell them that you can do so. So labor law is both normative and realistic, not trying to impose a liberal normative order where it does not fit, where it is rejected by people. And that's why, incidentally, I think that neoliberalization of labor law won't work. And here, the notion of the counter movement that counters the movement, so to speak, is something that needs to be analytically in our mind. It makes no sense to just develop a sort of coherent legal system. In addition to systematic thinking, in particular in this area, you have to think about social movements, about the dynamic of a society, about conflicts, standards of justice, and so on. And these are living; they are not dead. In other words, there is pragmatism and realism, which is absolutely needed to understand the institutions of labor law. It is not enough to deduce them from a general principle of, let's say, contractual equality, like you could if you put together a Roman law on contracts. Yeah. And to come to my conclusion and my most important exhibit, The right to strike. Going on strike is the strongest possible expression available to workers of their sense of justice being violated. Yeah? This is why almost all democratic labor law systems in some way recognize a right to strike. Now, this is sensational in the sense that it is a right to be in breach, to breach a valid contract. More than that, it is a right to prevent the employer from hiring alternatives to continue his or her business. It is a right to be sort of almost violently disruptive. And of course, I remember an account of a strike of mine workers in Wales in the early 20th century, when the relevant minister of Her Majesty's government was one Winston Churchill in his younger years, who noticed publicly that unfortunately, basically these people would have to be locked up because they are sort of causing public all sorts of things. But he said, you can't lock up 10,000 people. And if you lock them up, you don't have coal. And you need the coal that they pull out. Therefore, unfortunately, we have to talk to them. Yes? And I think this in a very nice way encapsulates this sort of pragmatism, realism, if you want, opportunism in a class society that is necessary in order to pacify this society, but not forever, only for the next year. Because you have a settlement now, things change, they always change. In a year from now, you better renegotiate that settlement, because if you stick to it as it is, you will have a surprise. The surprise is that it may not work anymore. So to finish, classical labor law intent on providing for fair contracting and decent work, not just allows workers to breach a valid contract, also prevents employers from hiring replacements, and so on. Realism again, classical labor, because it has no choice and because the right to strike helps balance the power relation between capital and labor. Because this collectivization of the employment contract works only if there is some sort of enforcement. You have to impress these people. An employer is not concerned with necessarily concerned with justice. He or she must be concerned with making a profit so that they can pay off the credit that they have taken up. After all, capitalism has something to do with money and credit, not necessarily with justice. You have to teach them that there is a need not just to make a profit, but also to be nice to people. And in order to be nice to people, you need to allow these people to tell their bosses, look, boss, unless you listen, you'll have a problem. And I think that is a very important central element of labor law. If you forget this, you will easily see this whole complex construct of modern classical labor law drift into the direction of contract law, pure and simple, which will be necessarily oppressive in a class society where the 5% sort of contract with the 95%. Thank you.